Welcome to the Solid Signal podcast for the week of August 29th, 2022. So this week's podcast was going to be all about antenna amplifiers, and I did a bunch of research, and I wrote down a bunch of notes, and then I realized that it actually just recorded pretty much the exact podcast that I wanted to record about 2 months ago, such as the life of an itinerant podcaster. So I'm switching gears and I'm going into something else that I wasn't really going to talk about for a couple of weeks, or maybe even months, or maybe even never. It has been recently rumored that NBC is looking to stop its programming during the 10 o'clock hour during the week and return that time to the local network affiliates. To give a little bit of a long history and not to bother you too much with that, but at one time, the networks, at that time there were three, used to control everything from 7 o'clock in the evening until 1 o'clock in the morning. And slowly the local affiliates asked for that time to be given back to them. And some of them, they had to go to the FCC to get it. So for many, many years, it's been 40 or some, maybe almost 50 years, we've seen this kind of mandated time with all the major networks where between 7 and 8 is what's called PTAR, primetime access rule time, where the local affiliates get it and the networks don't get it. And 11 to 11:30 is also the time for local network news. That may be changing with NBC, as NBC, as I said, is willing to potentially give up that 10 o'clock hour. And so there's a lot of opinions on this, and you're about to get mine. I do think that it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. And that's the funny thing, is for those people who are saying, oh, well, it's the end of broadcast television, this is the seventh sign, and this is where we're going to see the broadcast completely disappears. And other people who are saying, oh, this is great for local broadcasters. It's going to give them some time to get some eyeballs and sell some more much needed advertising so that they get the dollars they need to operate. I tend to be the kind of guy who says it's neither of those things and that it's not going to make a big difference. Why? Well, first of all, one of the things that we have all probably observed in the last 25 years is that we tend to be getting up earlier than we used to. You can find evidence for this all over the internet if you want to, but in your parents' day, we talk about the 9 to 5, but who does a 9 to 5 anymore? I haven't done a 9 to 5 in probably 30 years. Most people start work at 8 or 8:30 or earlier, and yeah, maybe they end at 5 or they end at 4 or whatever, but the 9 to 5 doesn't exist anymore. People are getting up earlier, and they're going to sleep earlier too. And that means the 10 o'clock hour just isn't that important. You know, I remember when I was young that the tradition of watching Johnny Carson at 11:30, and by the way, Johnny Carson owned the entire time from 11:30 until 1 o'clock in the morning. Everybody did it. I mean, and it wasn't just because there wasn't anything else to do in bed at that time, but that's just when people were starting to wind down. And there's still some people who aren't really winding down until 11 o'clock at night. Jake Buckler is one of those characters who doesn't really get settled in until about 11. But for every person who's like that, there's another person who's like, 9 o'clock? Why should I get up, do anything after 9 o'clock? And so there just isn't as much need for live programming at that time. You can say also there's DVRs. If you really want to watch something in the 10 o'clock hour, you can DVR it. It just doesn't need to be there. And really, overall, though, I think this speaks to what's been going on with NBC for coming on 30 years. And there's an interesting kind of parallel here. There was a guy at NBC during the late 1990s into the 2000s named Jeff Zucker. Now, Jeff Zucker was kind of in charge of, I think he was the head of programming or something. I'd have to Google it, but it's not super important. Really, it was his place to run. Let's put it that way. And it was Jeff Zucker whose plans and actions really doomed NBC for the next 20 years. It was Jeff Zucker in a lot of ways, who was involved in paying the folks at Friends, the actors, so much money that the network didn't have any money to develop new series. It was Jeff Zucker who was the one who tried to do the things, the kind of push that must-see TV block further than it should have been pushed, because he didn't invent must-see TV. That came up in the 80s. But to try to keep pushing that kind of must-see TV idea way beyond the point where it had expired, that was Jeff Zucker who did that. And he was the one, I put a lot of blame on him for putting NBC on the rocks. And NBC eventually being sold at one point from being part of General Electric, then it got sold again. It was part of Universal. I mean, Universal was sold, and there was a French company that owned Universal for a while. I should have done more research on this podcast, but I looked at the time and I realized I had to record it, and my other plans didn't pan out. So forgive me on that. But anyway, I think their name was Vivendi. Anyway, they bought Universal, and then Comcast came and bought them, and the NBC part got to be a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller part of a much bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger pie, and became less important, and so it became more of the path of least resistance, of not throwing money into it if they didn't think they were going to get money out of it, because these big swings that were possible in the 80s and 90s just weren't possible anymore. So, like I said, there's the kind of that straight line. Jeff Zucker wasted all this money, pushed the idiom of must-see TV much further than he should have, leading to NBC not having a lot of money, leading to NBC becoming less valuable and getting bought by another company that was bought by another company that was bought by another company. And that's where they are now, to where maybe their 10 o'clock hour is really not valuable enough for them to do anything with. And it's funny where we go from there, because where did Jeff Zucker go from there? Jeff Zucker, by the way, went to CNN. It's really hard to imagine it now, especially if you are part of the roughly 50% of the country that identifies with the bluer or more right-leaning part of the spectrum. This isn't a political podcast, and I'm not going to talk politics, but it's hard to imagine. But in the early 1990s, CNN was where it's at. CNN was the top dog. I mean, they controlled the idea of news. They redefined the idea of news. Everybody wanted to be like CNN, and nobody wanted to be like anything else but CNN. There was a time, back when we were younger, all of us were younger, that the newspapers ruled the roost. And after that, broadcast television news. But in the 1990s, the real winner was CNN. And CNN, might have lost their way, might have needed to modernize a little bit in the face of ongoing competition from other 24-hour news networks. And so they brought on, guess who? Jeff Zucker. Jeff Zucker created a lot more opinion programming, a lot more scripted programming. Jeff Zucker was the one who kind of cluttered up your entire screen with all of this stuff on the edges so that you were constantly being bombarded with all this information. That was Jeff Zucker's job at CNN to do. And a lot of people lost confidence in CNN. A lot of people viewed CNN as partisan and non-scientific and not even factual. Again, this is not a political podcast, so we're not going to necessarily agree or disagree with that. I'm only pointing out Jeff Zucker, because Jeff Zucker doing what he did at CNN, it weakened Turner Networks. It weakened Turner Networks to the extent that they started relying more on Warner Brothers, which was part of the Turner empire, and on HBO, which was part of that whole empire. And eventually, they became so weak that, and under the stewardship of AOL, which was once seen to be this gigantic, unstoppable force, that Warner Media itself, or what was known as Warner Brothers at the time, was sold off. lock, stock, and barrel became a part of AT&T in a move that almost immediately seemed like a bad idea. I say that with great clarity because AT&T basically sold all of Warner Media over to Discovery not that long ago, and not after having had it that long of time. There are a lot of folks, including myself, who are saying that Discovery's ownership of HBO and other Warner properties is already disastrous. Like I said, this isn't a political blog, and I'm not here to talk about the right or wrong, just report the facts. There are folks who are saying that the content divisions over at Warner are losing important diverse voices, that you're seeing less and less of a focus on different messages, different diverse messages out there, and more of a bowling it right down the middle kind of strategy, which is what Discovery has done. I'm not a huge Discovery fan. I wish the folks there well, and I know they put in a lot of hard work, but I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to that I enjoy watching 5,000 to 6,000 episodes of House Hunters, because I do not, and I choose not to do that. I've wandered around the subject a lot, but it's funny how when you look at somebody, the influence of somebody like Jeff Zucker in putting NBC potentially on the rocks and losing up to 5 hours of television per week, and everybody thinking that's a good idea, and HBO almost immediately, it seems like, wilting away from its premium status and moving towards something that's purely profit driven. And you keep hearing the name Jeff Zucker over and over again in the middle of all of that, and you just have to wonder. Anyway, getting back to the primary topic, I'm going to say that there are too many sources of programming today to worry about whether or not NBC keeps its 10 o'clock hour programming. Maybe what they could do is they could run reruns of other more popular programs. I've always felt like they should run some of their older programs. There's, because of the way that the laws were at the time, it was practically illegal for a television network to produce its own programs at one point, which is why you've got, for example, this weird situation where, Warner Brothers produced Friends, which was on NBC, but now, Friends has moved over to HBO Max, which is another, Warner affiliated property, instead of moving to Peacock, even though they're most closely affiliated with NBC. But NBC did produce a fair amount of programming in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, not just that, but Universal also produced programming for other networks during that time. And it'd be interesting to see if that stuff would fly in the 10 o'clock hour, or if they took some of the other things they've got, the movies that Universal has had over the years, and ran those during the 10 o'clock hour. You could run a movie in 2 nights. This is stuff that probably wouldn't cost a lot to produce for broadcast, and might, you just never know, might be appealing. I'll just say, make sure Jeff Zucker isn't a part of it. That is it for the Solid Signal podcast for this week. This is a bit of a longer, more rambling one, less planned out, and I tend to do those sometimes. So have a great week. I'll just tell you, like I always do, like and subscribe, leave a comment, makes me look good to the people who sign my paycheck, and you all have a great week.